No country has dared to ship Ukraine what they've been asking for months. Of course, many nations have supplied Ukraine with intelligence, munitions, and weapons that have allowed them to successfully destroy many Russian tanks and aircraft. But despite repeated pleas by Ukrainian top officials, the only country that has sent fighter jets into Ukraine is Russia. The international community has been unable to provide Ukraine with fighter jets, but the reason is not what you think. Only 3 days after the Russian invasion began, an announcement was made that confused everyone.
We are going to supply arms, fighters. We are going to provide even fighting jets.
Josep Borrell, the European Union's top foreign policy and security official, announced that the EU nations were going to provide Ukraine with fighter jets, and not just ammunition. And this worried Poland. See, the Ukrainian Air Force has MiG-29 and Su-27 fighter aircraft which date back to the Soviet era, and that's what the Ukrainian pilots are used to flying. If the EU were to send fighter jets to Ukraine, it would only make sense to send the MiG-29s, which Poland, Bulgaria, and Slovakia have in their fleet. But Poland didn't want to send their MiG-29s to Ukraine. In the current situation, the line between sending ammunition and sending weapons to Ukraine is blurry. It is publicly known that the US has sent Stingers to Ukraine, and even Russia reported destroying S-300 launchers that were provided by some EU state to Ukraine. But somehow, there seems to be no doubt that President Putin would regard sending fighter jets to Ukraine as an escalation. This might be because the fighter jets could be regarded as an offensive weapon, while surface-to-air missiles are considered a defensive weapon. Long story short, Poland could not ignore the Russian threats to attack any country that allowed Ukrainian jets to lift off from their airfields to engage Russian forces. And remember, President Putin had previously threatened to use the N-word. Shortly after Borrell's confusing announcement was made, NATO's Secretary General said that NATO is not going to be part of the conflict and that NATO is not going to send troops into Ukraine or move planes into Ukrainian airspace. Polish President Andrzej Duda also said that they are not going to send any jets into Ukrainian airspace, as it would risk putting NATO into direct conflict with Russia. Of course, Borrell later changed/denied his original comment, saying that the EU will support the Ukrainian army with the basic needs, like ammunition and fuel, but not jets. Even as late as March 6, 2022, the office of the Polish Prime Minister announced that Poland would not send its fighter jets to Ukraine or allow Ukraine to use Polish air bases. It seemed pretty settled that the EU, NATO, and Poland were all uncomfortable sending the MiGs to Ukraine. But on March 7th, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a TV appearance that he probably should not have. If Poland were to send its fighter jets to Ukraine, he was asked, would the United States green-light it, or would that escalate tensions with Russia?
No, that gets a green light. In fact, we're talking...
So the United States, which is a member of NATO, green-lighted Poland, which is also a member of NATO, to send its MiGs to Ukraine. What the US hadn't considered was Polish people's familiarity with potatoes. On the very next day, Poland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs announced that they are ready to deploy, immediately and free of charge, all their MiG-29 jets to the Ramstein Air Base and place them at the disposal of the government of the United States of America. Hot potato. A generous offer by Poland, although they also requested that the United States sell them used aircraft with corresponding operational capabilities, like the F-16s. Surprised by the Polish announcement, within hours, the Pentagon said that if those jets were to depart from a US and NATO base in Germany and fly into Ukrainian airspace, it would be a serious concern for the entire NATO alliance. Hot French fries? It's interesting to note that Antony Blinken's green light to Poland was mostly covered by right-wing media, whereas Poland's surprise announcement was covered pretty equally on both sides of the political aisle. And we know this easily thanks to Ground News, who's sponsoring today's video. Ground News scours the internet to show you every article on any given topic. The app and the website not only make it easy to compare news sources, but they also show you the political leaning of those sources. The news that we consume has been filtered by social media algorithms to feed our confirmation bias. But Ground News has a dedicated blind spot feed so you can quickly browse through stories you might be missing. The small team of independent media outsiders at Ground News are concerned about the future of news. They are not funded by a media company, big tech, or institutional investors. They're supported by subscribers. So if you're looking for a better way to stay informed about current news around the world, check out Ground News by clicking the link in the description. So for now, no MiG-29s for Ukraine. But why are these countries even sharing these plans publicly? Could they not just make plans behind closed doors and execute against them? Aircraft spare parts are already being sent. This would be the same spare parts, just assembled together. The thing is, even if this were to happen in secrecy, it would not be as simple as handing over the jets to Ukrainian pilots. They first need to be downgraded, just like Windows 11. The Polish MiGs were upgraded in 2013 and 2014 with new avionics and other equipment to increase their lifespan. Before sending those jets to Ukraine, some of the new, sensitive technologies installed on the MiGs would likely have to be pulled out, and some need to be downgraded back to the originals, which would be a time-consuming process. But even then, there are questions about the impact of such a transfer. US and NATO officials have said that 28 additional jets might not prove materially significant in the current context, where Russia has more modern aircraft. Ukraine has even asked the United States to send them F-15s and F-16s. The Ukrainian Air Force believes that they can train their experienced pilots on the American jets within a few weeks. But that doesn't seem feasible at all. The training for aircraft such as F-15s and F-16s for American pilots takes over 2 years at an absolute minimum, and that would essentially produce a pilot qualified in model, which is the lowest ring of pilots. They can fly the aircraft, but not fight it. For a Ukrainian pilot to go from a MiG airframe to something like an F-15 would be a challenge due to systems, language, and other factors, even on a stripped-down version, also known as export versions of the aircraft, which have reduced capability and thus have an easier learning curve. Either way, this process would take months and not weeks. But the real issue would be logistics. The amount of ground support equipment required for those aircraft is massive, and that's just to keep them airborne. To be able to use them effectively, they will require ordnance, avionics, petroleum, oil, lubricants, and a network to acquire uncommon materials. In a typical American flying unit, only about 5 to 10% are aircrew. The other 90 to 95% are support personnel with very specific specializations. So the MiGs are Ukraine's best option, at least in the short term. About 2 months after the hot potato game between Poland and the United States, the UK said that they will stand by any country who decides to send their fighter jets to Ukraine. The UK would be willing to backfill any shortfall by lending their air power to those countries. But is this similar to the green light that the US previously gave Poland? Or does this mean that the UK is ready to engage with Russia if things escalate to that point? At the expense of the people of Ukraine, this war is somehow testing NATO, but it's also questioning the effectiveness of nuclear deterrence. Because if we knew for sure that no nuclear buttons could be pushed, wouldn't the response of the international community to the Russian aggression have been different?